wouldn't zeros and ones and algorithms on a certain panpsychist view, couldn't they still have a degree of consciousness such that you put them together, you could still get that higher order consciousness out?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. And I mean, lots of panpsychists disagree with me on this, and certainly David Chalmers does. But it just seems to me, if as a panpsychist you think consciousness is kind of the stuff of matter,
Yeah.
then it's weird to think that's going to go with software rather than hardware. You know, if consciousness is the stuff of matter, that's hardware.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedicase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I really love thinking about cool stuff, and you're invited to come think with me. Today, I have with me a very special guest. I have with me Dr. Philip Goff. He's a philosopher at the University of Durham, and if you probably heard of this guy. He's all over the place. If you know anything about panpsychism, you've heard his name. He wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on panpsychism. He's got some awesome books, including Galileo's Error, which is Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. Like, he's all over the place. He's awesome. If you are into his dark materials, you may have seen an interview with him and the author. I'm really excited to get in deep on some of his deeper thoughts in panpsychism, and not just, what is panpsychism, though we will cover that. Before we jump in, however, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for making this podcast happen. You guys are awesome. If you have benefited personally from this podcast, if it's your top 5, top 10 favorite, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can find the link in the description wherever you're getting this podcast at. And if you're watching on YouTube, leave me a comment. Let me know what you think about panpsychism. Perhaps Dr. Goff will come back and see your stuff, so be cool. But let me know. What do you think? Do you get it? Did we explain it well? What do you think of the theory of consciousness? Without further ado, though, let's just pull them in and get going on fundamental reality, consciousness, and how we could possibly ground logic. Dr. Goff, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Brilliant. Hi, Parker. Good to be here. We've been planning this for a while.
That's
Looking forward
right.
to chatting.
Definitely, man. I'm super excited about this. Before we jump in on panpsychism, I always like to ask my guests, like, how'd you become a philosopher? How'd you get interested in it? You're a professional philosopher, man. Like, how'd that happen?
God knows. I've just always been obsessed with philosophy, I think. A story I've told a few times. Apparently my parents said that when I was 4, I asked, why are we here? But I think we had just moved house at that point, so I think maybe I was just confused about the location. But yeah, I've always been obsessed with, how things hang together. I was raised Catholic. I remember asking the priest, how the Big Bang fitted together with Adam and Eve, sort of like these different things, how do they fit together? And consciousness has always been, the big thing that's so hard to fit in. But there are other things, free will, value, mathematical objects, these things that it seems almost on the face of it don't fit with our standard scientific story of the universe. And it's not because I like mystery. It's because I don't like mystery. I want it all to fit together. And so, I've always been driven by that, things that don't kind of make sense. There's an inconsistency. Like, I used to love Columbo, the 70s detective, and he'd start off with what everyone else believed about the murder, and then he'd be like, something's bothering me. I can't really do that. Something's bothering me.
Pretty good.
So it's not bad, actually, isn't it? So he's this consciousness, this materialism about consciousness, something's bothering me. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, in terms of actually doing it as a job, I think I've been very lucky because I just wanted to drop out and become a rock star, really. I nearly didn't go to university, and my brother said, well, you can just go and just do your band at university, otherwise you'll have to get a job. And so, yeah, and I don't know, I ended up just carrying on and getting eventually scraped an academic job and stuck around. And yes, I can easily imagine actually a nearby possible world where I didn't stick at it. I mean, I was incredibly lazy at high school. But anyway, I feel very lucky. I've ended up
Yeah.
where I am.
Well, it sounds like there's some kind of correlation between rock stars and consciousness. And I'm thinking about Chalmers and now I hear about you too. So maybe that's a thing. Maybe the rock stars find their way to consciousness research.
Yeah, he's not literally well, I'm not literally a rock star neither. He does the zombie blues, doesn't he? Actually,
Yeah,
so
he
that,
does.
yeah,
He
there's
does.
that.
Yeah. I've watched.
I when I am at those conferences, I do the ghost blues,
Okay.
which is somewhere online. Me doing the ghost
Ghost
blues,
Blues. I'll have
but
to check that out.
ghostly blues.
Well, so you're probably best known for panpsychism, and you've done a ton of interviews, conversations where you've defined that. Just one more time for us. Just what is panpsychism, and then we get to go in deep on more of your papers and such.
Yeah, panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical universe. So standardly at the fundamental level of physics, the basic building blocks have incredibly simple forms of experience, and then very complex experience at the human or animal biological level is somehow built up from very simple kinds of experience at that fundamental level.
Hmm.
So it doesn't literally mean that everything is conscious. The basic idea is that the basic building blocks of reality are consciousness, but maybe not every random combination of particles has its own consciousness. So it doesn't mean your socks are conscious. It means the little smallest things your socks are made up of are conscious.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. Well, so going in on that then, why opt for panpsychism and put consciousness? I want to get into like priority monism and priority microphysicalism stuff, but just staying where we're at right now, why go in for panpsychism instead of pan-proto-psychism, where they're like, potentially conscious, but you get enough of them together, and then maybe you get emergent consciousness or something like that. Why prefer pan instead of
Yeah.
pan-proto?
Well, I'm actually very open to. I don't get asked that question very often. I'm
Hmm.
actually very open to pan-proto-psychism.
Hmm.
I standardly people think of the options are, on the one hand, materialism, that we
Yeah.
can just explain consciousness in the terms of conventional science, chemistry, physics. On the other hand, dualism, that it's consciousness is not physical. Maybe it's in the soul, or in any case, it's somehow separate from the physical properties of the brain. So I reject both of those options, and I go for this middle way of panpsychism. But actually, another middle way position closely related is some kind of pan-proto-psychism, where at the fundamental level that there isn't consciousness,
Hmm.
but there's some mysterious nature that goes beyond the properties we learn about in physical science. But it's not consciousness, it's proto-conscious. What does that mean? Well, in the right combinations, it somehow gives rise to consciousness. Someone like Tom McClelland, who I'd like to have on my podcast at some point soon, actually, adopts this kind of view. And I guess my problem with it is it's a possibility,
Hmm.
but my problem is it's an essentially incomplete theory. It's
Hmm.
okay to call it proto-conscious is basically to say we don't know what it is, but it makes consciousness. But then you want to know, well, what is it? Give me a positive definition of it. And a lot of people who go for this view adopt, as Tom McClelland does, Mysterianism. They just say, well, we don't know. Maybe we can never know.
Yeah.
We can't access the hidden nature of matter in that way.
Yeah.
So we'll never know. And so that's a possibility. But I guess just in terms of simplicity grounds, I think one thing we do know about the nature of matter, once we reject dualism, one thing we know about the nature of matter is that some of it has this consciousness involving nature. At least part of the nature of my brain, I think, as a panpsychist, I think when I reflect on my consciousness, I'm reflecting on the the inner nature of my brain. You know, these colors and sounds and smells and tastes. That is the inner nature of my living brain. And so that's all we know directly about the nature of matter. And then we're speculating about the nature of matter outside of brains. It could be that it has some other nature, but why would you think that if you don't have reason? You know, the more simple, elegant, parsimonious view is that the nature of the stuff outside of brains is continuous with the nature of stuff in brains, and also having this consciousness involving nature. So I think panpsychism should be the sort of default position. But I don't go like my former PhD supervisor, Galen Strawson, who's a panpsychist. He's just got this strong intuition that you can't get consciousness from non-consciousness, so it must be there all along.
That's what I was thinking.
See that.
You don't go in for that. Okay.
I don't see why there couldn't be some mysterious properties that somehow aren't consciousness but make consciousness in the right combinations. I don't think we have any positive understanding of such properties, but
it'd be like an empirical claim, right? Like you'd need to see some evidence showing that.
That it's hard to know what. Yes, but I mean, it's hard to know what evidence could point one way or the other. As I often love to, want to point out, consciousness is not publicly observable, so there are real limits, unfortunately, to what we can pin down with experiments. And so, you can't. All you can get at empirically is the behavior of an electron.
I love that you go there. I love that, because so many others in philosophy of mind are I don't know, they're pseudo behaviorists or something like that, where they really put a lot of pressure on the behavior. And I think I really appreciate you being like, no, the behavior is not it, because we can't get at the, I don't know if you'd say the qualitative nature or the qualia or the first person perspective, but yeah, the behavior doesn't say it, because something could pass the Turing test and not be conscious.
Yeah, consciousness is standardly in physical science, it's all about explaining observable behavior. You've got a system that behaves in a certain way, and you postulate a mechanism to explain its behavior ultimately, or you model its behavior in some kind of mathematical framework, or you ultimately postulate laws of physics. But consciousness is something we know about in a very different way. We're just immediately aware of our feelings and experiences. It's a very different kind of datum. And when I say, Sarah is seeing red or feeling anxious, I'm not making a claim about her behavior. I mean, I was debating Sean Carroll last week about, he seemed to think talk of consciousness is a sort of way of talking about complicated behavior, but I don't think at least doesn't seem to be what I'm saying when I say
with you. Yeah,
Sarah's feeling anxious. I think I'm talking about how she's feeling, and it's just a very different kind of claim. So, the tools of physical science, it depends what you're trying to do, but trying to give that kind of reductive explanation, like when you postulate a mechanism to explain behavior, well, that just seems like really ill-fitting here. It's like, analogy I give sometimes. It's like saying telescopes are really good in astronomy, so probably they're really good in pure math too. It's just a totally different explanatory project.
Yeah.
Standardly in physical science, we're trying to account for behavior. This is just not. It's just a very different kind of explanatory project.
Yeah. Well, I think you're probably right about panpsychism and pan-protopsychism, and going with the simpler option would be panpsychism. Unless you had like other desiderata or whatever you wanna fulfill, like avoiding the credulous stare. The pan-protopsychist might have better, might fare better in that case. Say, well, look, I'm not saying everything's conscious or anything like that, but at some point, obviously. But I do like what you're saying, and I think that's, both of them are so intriguing. I think of like William Hasker's Emergent dualism on pan-protopsychism. I guess you could probably do it on panpsychism as well. But then we get to mix in some dualism here, so it's like a halfway between the dualist and you. So that would be really fun too. I want to get in on Cosmopsychism and universal consciousness and stuff like that, because these are some papers that you've written that I've really, really appreciated and loved, and I haven't heard you talk a ton about them. So Maybe let's get into priority monism first to define some terms here, and then set up like your cosmopsychism. Actually, man, I'm sorry. Let's go with constitutive panpsychism. What is that, and how's that different than emergent panpsychism?
So this is one big distinction among panpsychists. This is David Chalmers' term, constitutive panpsychism. And well, mainly it's a disagreement on the relationship between our consciousness at the biological level and consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. So that, I mean, that's a key question for a panpsychist. If you think there's consciousness at the level of fundamental physics, how does it relate to our consciousness? And, you know, most importantly, how does our consciousness emerge from consciousness at the more fundamental level? I mean, that's ultimately what we're interested in, right? We don't want to if we can't explain our consciousness, it's kind of game over. And there are, broadly speaking, two options here: a sort of more reductive one and a non-reductive one. So the reductive one is the constitutive panpsychism. I sometimes call it weak emergentism, weak emergentist panpsychism, as opposed to strong emergent. Anyway, constitutive view is really, in some sense, all there are conscious particles, you know, and okay, my mind exists, but it's just a collection of conscious particles. It's just what you get when conscious particles are functioning in the right way, or arranged in the right way. So I like to give the analogy of a party. Think about the relationship between a party and the people dancing and drinking and having fun. In some sense, that's just two different ways of describing the same thing. It's not like there's the people dancing and drinking and then they produce this party that floats above their heads.
Right.
You know, all it is for there to be a party is for there to be people dancing and drinking. You know, the reality of the party wholly consists in the activities of the partiers. So similarly, for the reductive panpsychist, you know, all it is for me to have consciousness, for my brain to be conscious, is for conscious particles to be arranged in the right way. So Luke Roelofs, I think, is the best person defending this kind of very reductive panpsychism. So it's just like reductive materialism, except the particles are conscious. But then the emergentist view, or the strong emergentist view, this is the problem with this word emergence. Philosophers use it in a different way to scientists.
Yeah.
Scientists tend to use it for this more reductive thing, whereas philosophers tend to use it for a more anti-reductive thing. So
because philosophers use supervene, right? That's the more reductive version.
Supervenience. Well, supervenience used to be a more popular term than it is.
Yeah.
And the reason it's not referred to much is it's really just what we call a merely modal notion. So modal means to do with possibility and necessity. So to say it supervenes is roughly to say that there's a necessary connection. So to say everything supervenes on the physical is to say the physical facts necessitate everything else. And that's fine. People still talk about supervenience, but I guess what people move to thinking is that's not really explaining very much. We want to say, well, why is it necessitating? Is there a sort of reduction? Is there an identity? And so people tend to talk about grounding now, as a sort of more explicitly explanatory relationship, not just saying there's some necessary connection.
Okay.
So grounding, I guess, you'd think of as the more constitutive view. But then strong emergence, sorry, I'm throwing around lots of terms here. Let's just stick with emergence and constitutive. So constitutive is the more reductive one, like the party and the partiers. Emergence is the more anti-reductive one, where in some sense particle consciousness produces our consciousness, but our consciousness is something radically new. So maybe there's new fundamental laws of nature that bridge the gap.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's just basic combinatorial powers particles have that kick in when they combine in a certain way. But either way, when a human conscious mind emerges, it's something radically new. There's kind of new forms of consciousness here. It might not be just at the human level. It might be, combination begins at cells maybe, and so the consciousness of a cell is sort of something radically new and in the consciousness of a slightly bigger organic unit. Anyway, but I mean, and then, well, to finish off, I guess I would go for probably some kind of middle way position. And I've got a paper on my website. How exactly does panpsychism explain consciousness? But I think there are various kind of middle way positions. I'm inclined to think maybe a more reductive position about sensory consciousness. But when it comes to something I'm talking about a lot in my new book, the consciousness that's involved in thought or understanding, I think it's harder to give a reductive story about that. So
yeah.
So I'm open to a sort of hybrid of the two.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. It's helpful and it's confusing. So if I think of like the categories of priority microphysicalism and priority monism, Schaffer's language. He's been on the podcast, so we can talk about this freely. If someone has some questions, they can go back and watch that one. Do you go in for one over the other, or do you have like a middle way? Would seem like a priority, like macro physicalism or something like that. But maybe I'm just totally mixing categories here, and you wouldn't say that. But when it comes to priority micro and monism, do you side with one of those, or do you find a middle way there too?
So I think these are two different distinctions
Okay.
that can be mixed and matched in different ways. So
Sure.
you can have, I mean, so you could have a reductionist priority monism. Let's just use constitutive and emergence. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm muddying the water by bringing in new terms. You could have a constitutive priority monism, and you could have an emergentist priority monism. You could have a constitutive micropsychism and an emergentist micropsychism. I do tend to go for the cosmopsychism version. I often talk about panpsychism in the kind of particle-based version of it.
Yeah.
But actually, I do tend to go for the cosmopsychist version because of one particular challenge in this area, which is how you get something with the structure of my consciousness out of something of the structure of physics.
Yeah.
And if we're starting off with lots of little pinpricks of consciousness, like lots of little conscious particles, and you stick them all together, it looks like you're just going to have some really complicated aggregate of trillions and trillions and countless. How many electrons are there in my head? How many fundamental particles? It looks like that doesn't match the structure of my experience. Whereas, well, the view I prefer and closer to the kind of view many theoretical physicists like is a sort of more field ontology rather than a particle ontology, where the fundamental building blocks of reality are not particles but universe-wide fields.
Yeah.
And then particles are sort of local excitations in those fields. So on that view, the fundamental forms of consciousness are already these unified, structured things, and then our consciousness kind of emerges from that structure. So rather than like lots of little things, sticking them together, you start with a complicated, unified consciousness, and human consciousness kind of fragments out of that.
Yeah.
So, and again, I would have a sort of a little bit of I would have a priority monist kind of panpsychism, where the fundamental things are these universe-wide forms of consciousness, and then a sort of mixture of emergence and constitutive panpsychism. To some extent, my consciousness is just inherited from the consciousness of these fundamental fields in physics. But then some aspects of my consciousness, like my thought and my conceptual understanding, that they seem to me radically new forms of conscious experience. And so, and I think when they emerge, they're probably gonna change things a bit. They're probably gonna change how my brain functions, because there are these kind of new forms of consciousness that pop up.
Yeah, man, that's really fascinating. So, in one sense, there's like this hard problem of consciousness. Like, how do we get phenomenal facts from physical facts? And you go, well, they're there at the bottom. So we go in for panpsychism because you're not going to get it somewhere. You don't have to find a Sorites point or anything like that. And then you say, well, how do we get consciousness, single unified consciousness, maybe from all these little fundamental BBs, and you go, well, just put it at the grand scale. Go with fields, and so you go all the way down when it comes to a hard problem, and maybe to combat the combination problem, you go all the way up, and you say, no, we're starting up here, and it, even though at first it seems really counterintuitive to say these kind of things, it does look like a really simple answer to say, look, like that, just good luck doing it any other way, right? Like, is that, do you think that's kind of a motivation for you?
Yeah, so
Simplicity?
the Cosmopsychism is to address one specific aspect of the combination problem. If you look at David Chalmers' paper on the combination problem, distinguishes three aspects, one to do with subjects, one to do with structure, and one to do with qualities. So the Cosmopsychism for me is really about structure. How does something with the structure of my conscious mind arise ultimately from something in the structure of physics?
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, so why go for this? I mean, what you're always trying to do is go for the simplest theory that can account for the data.
Right.
But for me, the data is not just, I think most people think, what's the data for science? It's just observation experiments. But to my mind, no, that's not all the data. There's also the reality of experience.
Yeah.
So we have to formulate the simplest theory that can account for both. And I think this is the simplest theory that can account for both. I mean, to put it broadly speaking, I think, there are three options. You start with physics and try and get consciousness out.
Yeah.
You start with consciousness, try and get physics out.
Yeah.
Or you take both, matter and consciousness, as fundamental. That's the dualist view. So I guess I think the first option just is incoherent. You can't get consciousness out of physics. The dualist option is a possibility, but it's not very elegant, not very parsimonious. So the option of getting physics and everything else out of consciousness looks to be, it has the simplicity of materialism and the coherence of dualism. So and then you get into the, as we have been doing, get into the technical questions, or which of these versions works out and which doesn't. So I think I find the totally reductionist panpsychist picture that Luke Roelofs goes for a bit implausible because of I find thought experience seems to be something radically new. And I think the Cosmopsychist version works better for getting the structure. So that's the particular version of panpsychism I go for.
Yeah. I'm trying to think how to. It's so good. I appreciate it. Thanks for summing that all up. I want to get into like subjects and stuff, and Cosmopsychism. You have this great paper, to the universe design itself, and in there it's. I don't think you're saying like this is the theory, but you're saying could it happen? Let me try to solve this. Let me see if we can do this. And you're trying to make sense of cosmological fine tuning, and saying like the universe is designed itself. And you say there's just two modifications you need to make. The universe has to be an agent, a conscious subject that responds to reasons, has reasons responsiveness, and it has to be able to represent the future in order to like plan ahead and design these cosmological laws. It's really, really fascinating. I think it's something that theists haven't thought through. And I was put on to this by my professor, Brandon Rickabaugh, because theists and atheists are always going back and forth, but there's a middle way, and this is really fascinating, and you're one of the proponents here. So when it comes to agentive cosmopsychism, where there's the universe, the cosmos is a conscious agent, how do we make sense of Chalmers' subject condition in the combination problem? Is that subject summing? Is that his terminology?
Yeah. So you've got different aspects, as I say, of the combination problem. One of them we've been discussing is how you get structure. So it's all about the connection between biological consciousness and consciousness at the level of physics. How do we understand the relationship? One is, how do we get the structure of my consciousness from the structure at the level of physics? But another is just, how do you get another subject? So subject is just a kind of semi-technical term for something that has consciousness.
Right.
And a conscious mind, a subject, seems to be something deeply unified. You know, if you think of all there's lots of different aspects to my experience right now, the colors, the sounds, the feels, but they're not just sitting in isolation, they're sort of experienced together in a sort of deeply unified way. How do you get that deeply unified subject out of sticking lots of little subjects together? Or if you're going cosmopsychist, if you're starting off with a deeply unified universe mind,
right,
how do lesser minds fragment away from that? Well, again, I mean, this is another reason why I think the pure reductionist option is pretty implausible.
Yeah.
Because I do think there's something irreducible about a conscious subject. So in some sense, I think I would take a strong emergentist view that when a new subject emerges from the universe, and it's not going to be just at the level of humans, presumably.
Sure.
In some sense, there is a radical addition. There is an addition to reality. But that doesn't mean all of its consciousness is new. So I think that this is what people.
Oh yeah, yeah.
People contrast these two ideas. So this is my paper. How exactly does panpsychism explain consciousness? And people think it's either human subjects are totally new and all their consciousness is totally new, or it's all reductive. But I would rather say, no, maybe the subject is new, but the consciousness that, as it were, fills that subject is old. So if you think of a subject as like a glass bottle or something,
yeah,
and then it's filled with consciousness from that's already there at the level of fundamental physics, and then maybe there's a sprinkling of new consciousness on the top, which is the kind of conceptual understanding. Yeah, that's basically my picture. That so let's say my mind emerges maybe early on in, sometime in my mother's womb.
Yeah.
So there's some radically new subject, but it's filled with consciousness that was already there, streams of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics.
Mm-hmm.
And then the baby's born, and as it grows, as it comes to understand the world, sort of new conceptual experience emerges on top of the old forms of experience. That's kind of the view I take. But anyway, that was only part of your question. So this middle way between God and atheism. Yeah, I mean, I hate dichotomies. People get stuck in these dichotomies of, US capitalism or Soviet communism, God or Dawkins, materialism or Jew. Whose side are you on? And you get put on. You can hear people trying to put you on the other side. I think, when you talk, are you on my side or are you on the other side? And yeah, so I mean, my new book is much more on this. It's exploring positions between God and atheism. The cosmopsychist view is one of them. I explore also sort of non-standard designers, limited God, evil God, indifferent God, the simulation hypothesis. And also natural teleology, that view Thomas Nagel has defended in his book Mind and Cosmos, that maybe there are just laws of nature with purposes built into them. But in any way, I think the fine-tuning is just pretty uncontroversial physics, and I think everyone's in denial about it, because for over 100 years there wasn't anything. I mean, more than that, if you're thinking of science in general, if you just think of physics in particular, there wasn't any evidence of God or teleology or purpose, and then people just got used to the idea. That's what, science has ruled all that out.
Yeah, right.
And then the evidence changes and people can't handle it. And we're still in a period of time, I think, when people are just refusing to accept it. The great economist Keynes, someone said to him once, "You didn't used to think that." And he said, "Well, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" And
you just triggered all of my libertarian listeners by mentioning Keynes, but that's okay, folks. We're not talking about
if you want to be triggered, libertarian listeners, Google my article, "No Taxation Isn't Theft."
Oh no.
And get annoyed.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's so many things there that were so good, and maybe you haven't finished the thought, so feel free. But one thing you did mention simulation hypothesis in there, and I think that's so cool because not because I think the simulation hypothesis is awesome or anything like that, because that's what a lot of public thinkers and abstract thinkers who aren't philosophers talk about. I work on a college campus. I talk with athletes every day, and we talk about God, and they always go, "What if we're living in a simulation hypothesis, or what if we're living in a computer simulation?" And I always bring that up to my philosopher friends, and many of them are like, "That old thing, isn't that just brain in a vat again?" And it's like, man, whatever it is, they're talking about it. Here's our chance to drag in some more abstract thinkers into philosophy. And so I love what you do. I love that you take those kind of things, and I love that you are fighting against the dichotomy stuff. It's really fun.
No, absolutely. I mean, the simulation hypothesis, it's not just a skeptical thing. There's a very interesting argument. Oh God, what's his name? My mind's gone blank.
Bostrom?
Bostrom, of course,
Yeah.
Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom, I wish, before I went on Joe Rogan's podcast, I wish I'd watched what I think is perhaps the only other interview he's done with a philosopher, which was Nick Bostrom.
Yeah.
And it was all about, Bostrom trying to explain the argument, and Joe Rogan sort of not getting it. And I
That's
think
funny, man.
I would have rethought my strategy for getting the hard problem of consciousness across to Joe Rogan if I'd
Yeah.
watched that. But anyway, you live and learn.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, there's an important argument here. It's not just skepticism. It's
Right.
If you have good reason to think there will one day be many simulations, then it starts to look improbable that we are the few who are one of the few who are actually physical rather than simulated. I mean, my problem with it is I don't think a simulation would be conscious.
Yeah.
But
well, wait,
it's
hold
a
on.
serious
That's
argument.
really fascinating. So that's what my dualist friends usually say. Yeah, that they all, I think it's committed to functionalism, and I think functionalism's false. But what if it was panpsychism? You simulate the structure. Is that still functionalism? If you simulate the structure of consciousness or digital, wouldn't zeros and ones and algorithms on a certain panpsychist view, couldn't they still have a degree of consciousness such that you put them together, you could still get that higher order consciousness out?
Yeah, it could be, and I mean, lots of panpsychists disagree with me on this, and certainly David Chalmers does. But it just seems to me, if as a panpsychist you think consciousness is kind of the stuff of matter,
Yeah,
then it's weird to think that's going to go with software rather than hardware. If consciousness is stuff of matter, that's hardware.
yeah,
Especially, look, if you've got a kind of strong emergentist, partially strong emergentist position where you really need these new subjects, these new containers emerging to get consciousness at the higher level. And it just seems unlikely to me that the signals for those new containers to emerge would be to do with kind of computation and software. And I mean, David Chalmers has got an intriguing argument for the kind of functionalism that you would need for the simulation hypothesis we discussed on my podcast. And my point is, I think it assumes the falsity of strong emergentism and assumes a very reductive constitutive panpsychist view or constitutive view. And actually, I suggested to Chalmers you could sort of run it. I think I talk about this in my new book as well. You could run the argument in the other way, the other direction, right? You could start from the thesis that a simulation wouldn't be conscious, and then get a strong emergentist conclusion if the rest of the reasoning is sound. So anyway, but you might go for the simulation hypothesis not on those grounds, but because for the fine tuning, there's it looks like it's just incredibly crazy odds that the numbers for life would be there by chance. I think it's because it's a bit abstract. We it's easy for us to ignore it, but it is kind of crazy odds. But if you have problems with standard theism, as I do, the problem of evil, then you might look to alternative design hypotheses, and the simulation hypothesis is one of them.
Yeah, I always you talk a lot about simplicity when I listen to you and when I read your stuff, and it's huge. And I think simulation hypothesis isn't as simple as base reality hypothesis, right? There's an extra step there. But if you're driven by fundamental fine tuning stuff, then you go, yeah, okay, there's a designer. But you can, unless you're saying the the simulator is a necessary being, then you still need an explanation for the simulator. Like what's the deal with them? And you could go in and say, well, hey, maybe we're in a simulation hypothesis, maybe we're in a simulation, but we got agentive Cosmopsychism behind that, and that designed fundamental fine tuning laws.
Yeah, I mean, one thing the simulation hypothesis person might say is, well, maybe the simulator's universe isn't fine tuned. So,
how could they make the simulation though if it's not? If there's no standard laws and things pop in and out of existence.
No. I mean, I'm saying it's not. There's a difference between a universe being life conducive and being fine tuned. Like I think 50 years ago, we knew the universe was life conducive, but we didn't think that you'd need very specific numbers to get a life conducive universe.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the surprising discovery of fine tuning, that it's balanced on a knife edge. It could. So I think there are possible universes that are life conducive, but the laws of physics aren't fine tuned, because there's loads of ways you can get life. But it so happens that the kind of universe we are in, with you need very precise numbers to get life. So it could be that in the simulator's universe, it's life conducive, but it's not fine tuned, and so there's no motivation to think it was designed. Maybe they left fine tuning in their universe as a sort of signature or something. But I mean, you could bring in the cosmological argument there.
Yeah.
But then that's more, that's a different argument. Someone might buy the fine tuning, not buy the cosmological argument. But maybe you could. But yeah, and it's certainly, as you say, another option is agentive cosmopsychism. Maybe it's not. I mean, it's still a fairly big ontological cost, as you say. The this whole meta universe. But maybe there's nothing supernatural. It's just the universe is conscious, and it kind of designed itself. So in a way, that's I try to argue it's actually an incredibly parsimonious hypothesis. It sounds really extravagant, but I might write a paper, actually. You're interested in philosophy of religion, aren't you? I might write a paper that, Swinburne's argument for God is on simplicity grounds. And I might try to say, if you buy all that, you should go one step further and identify God with the universe. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, and some I guarantee some listeners right now have already thought about this, and they thought about panentheism, and you have this great line in I think it's in your universal consciousness paper, where you say this isn't panentheism, this is theo and panism, because panentheism is there's God outside of the universe, and then the universe exists in God, but there's more to God than there is to the universe. You're saying there's not more to God than the universe. Theo and panism, God is in the universe, but he's not. There's no part of him that's outside.
Oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. It's quite good, isn't it?
It's a great line. Well, yeah, I like philosophy of religion stuff. So
the important thing for me is the designer, whether they're supernatural. I'm open to a supernatural designer. Probably think it shouldn't be probably not the ideal on parsimony grounds. But the more important thing is whether the designer is supernatural or not. They're not all. They can't be all. They can't have all the omni characteristics
because of evil.
For me, that would be.
I know you don't like skeptical theism. There, I saw some tweets from you on that.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about this again in plugging my new book a lot tonight. But yes,
that's great.
Skeptical theism. Do you want to talk about that or
no? I'm just I'm excited for your new book, and maybe I can coax you into coming back on to talk about it when it comes out, because that's like right up my audience's alley, and my alley as well. All the stuff you've been working on, and Really excited for it, and I'm glad that you've considered it. I'm glad that you thought through, and I think you have arguments against skeptical theism in your book.
Yeah, I don't know how original they are. Kind of. I
Sure.
mean, I guess I think. Oh, I have to think what they are now. I guess I just think all we can ever do is do the best we can with the evidence we have, and that's the rational thing to do. I've got a nice analogy actually. If you know, we now know, don't we, or believe that a huge percentage of the matter in the universe is dark matter.
Yeah.
Is it 90% or something crazy like that? Oh, I can't remember
Something
now.
I never know, because I watch his Dark Materials, and I don't know if they're embellishing or not. And right, so
Yeah, when I talked to Philip Pullman, the author of that, he was saying he was inspired by dark matter, and he was saying, "I hope they don't discover what this
yeah,
is before this
I
book
got
comes out."
that. That was awesome.
But it could be, if we sort of knew the nature of dark matter, it could have implications not just for our theory of dark matter, but for our theory of matter we know about. It might sort of shift what is a plausible theory of that.
Yeah.
But we don't hold off theorizing about the matter we do know about on that basis. We just do the best with what we can. That's
Yeah.
all we ever do.
Yeah.
So like skeptical theists want to say, well, look, there could be all these moral considerations that God knows about that we don't. But I think, well, we just do the best, what we always do, the best with what we can. And I think
Yeah.
in terms of the moral considerations we do know about and our best minds are reflected upon, it looks really implausible that it would, well, it looks to my, here's how I would put the problem of evil. I think it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create this universe. I think that's a really, it's not, I don't infallibly know that,
Sure.
but I think there's a lot of justification behind that
Given what you've
moral
experienced,
proposition.
yeah.
Given what we know, in the way we normally form ethical views, like slavery's bad or whatever, I think that's a pretty solid moral intuition that it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create the universe,
Yeah.
a universe like this.
Well, I always wonder if it's like an internal versus external critique. Like if it's posed as an argument against a theist's view, the theist has a lot of different tools and a lot of different arguments and evidence that they say, look, I'm coming from this perspective, and I have reasons to think that God has a morally sufficient reason. Whereas if a theist is coming to a agnostic or atheist or non-theist of some stripe and says, look, you should believe, even though you have this evidence of evil, you should believe, because of skeptical theism, they're going to have their evidence and say, well, look, that's just not, it's not the same for me. I don't have the same, I would say, worldview. I know that term is kind of loaded now and it means a bunch of different things, but we're working with different conceptual schemas or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Parker. I think that's right. To my mind, I just can't. I don't think there's much, if any, reason to take seriously that God is all powerful. For example, I think there's fine tuning gives you reason to take seriously a designer or some kind of teleology. As I say, I'm open to impersonal teleological laws.
Sure.
But I actually agree with Richard Swinburne that maybe there's some kind of simplicity that maybe in some sense the omni-God is the default position because it's the most simple.
Yeah.
But those kind of simplicity considerations are pretty easily overwhelmed by evidence. So I really don't see much evidence. And so, if I thought the ontological argument worked, then yeah, I'd have a serious motivation for trying to get skeptical theism to work or trying to square the circle. But I just don't see a motivation for going there. And so, I just see no motivation not to take evil at face value. But I mean, this is, I think there are just terms. I mean, there are forms of Christianity, for example. I was surprised to discover there are have a God of limited power, for example, and not intact. So, so this is not necessarily inconsistent with these traditional forms of theism.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I think, and you make a good point about simplicity. Like, there's a inherent ceteris paribus, or however you say it, clause in simplicity claims. You all things being equal, if two theories both make sense of the same phenomena, then the simpler wins. But you might say, hey, look, I don't think it makes sense of evil in the same way. And so even though it might be simpler, it's not explaining all the data, including evil. So
Yeah. I mean, I like Richard Swinburne's analogy of the speed of light. If apparently, I only know this off his authority,
sure.
we used to think the speed of light was infinite before we had empirical evidence to the contrary. But as soon as we get empirical evidence to the contrary, we don't say, "Oh, is there any way we can keep it infinite?" You know, you just no. You go for the key thing is the data. You
Yeah.
go for the simplest theory that's compatible with the data. So yeah, so I agree with Richard Swinburne. You know, in some sense, if you didn't have evidence to the contrary, you'd assume the designer was all powerful. But we have evidence to the contrary thing. I put this to Richard Swinburne at the British Philosophy of Religion annual conference, and he said he now thinks like evil doesn't count against God at all, which is not what he says in his book, The Existence of God. But
wow, that's wild. Yeah, looking to get him on next month, so we'll see. Maybe I can ask him about that.
he's a very interesting thinker, I think. You know,
Seriously,
bringing all the Bayesian stuff into philosophy of
yeah,
religion, I think is.
man, you're such a cool guy. I love the way you think. You're like pulling stuff from all over the place. It doesn't seem like you have. Maybe you have biases. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like you have like an overarching bias that keeps you from reading certain people or thinking a certain way. And really appreciate that, man. This is
Oh, that's
awesome.
very kind of you to say so. Yeah, well, I do. I just really do want the truth. You know,
Yeah.
I don't really. I don't really. I just it does annoy me the dichotomies and
Yeah.
the. You know, I mean, I hate. You know, I hate certain things both sides hate. You know, I hate. Oh, I don't. Anyway, I hate
Yeah.
certain ethical views of. I mean, what really winds me about kind of William Lane Craig or something. You know, is the ethics, and
Hmm.
I'm hooked on his podcast, but he he never talks about poverty or
Hmm.
liberation or and I'd say okay, it's a philosophy podcast,
Yeah.
but he does talk about
Politics.
gay
Yeah.
marriage and abortion and violence in movies. It's
Hmm.
just bloody violence in movies, but I think on most ethical issues I'm probably pretty solidly on the secular side, I'd
Yeah.
say, but I don't know. I just on the fine tuning, for example, I just think the secular side is just wildly in denial. I mean, even if I've got arguments against the multiverse. I think there's an identifiable fallacy in the inference from fine tuning to a multiverse, which is something I was persuaded of. I used to just think the multiverse was totally a possibility. But even if you do think that, it's still incredibly speculative physics. And so I think that really everyone ought to, because of the fine tuning, everyone ought to give some credence to a design hypothesis.
Yeah.
And the only reason they don't is just cultural reasons.
Which in some sense is really cool. So I am a theist, and we could think about your project, Cosmopsychism, especially like agentive Cosmopsychism, in a couple different ways. We could think, well, look, he's stealing people from the faith. He's stealing people from theism because he's the middle ground. People are on their way over to theism because of cosmological, fine tuning stuff, and they stop at his, they stop with him. You could also look at it and say, look, maybe they do have a bias against any kind of theism, so they don't even want to look at any kind of fine tuning stuff. But Goff gave them a way out of that, a way to think about it more deeply, and maybe we can convince some people, or maybe we could at least have the conversation now because it's not as threatening. It's not. I have to go to church tomorrow because I agreed that there is fine tuning.
Yeah, I guess it could work out in your favor.
Well, just to have more conversations, like that's even better. I
Yeah,
think people being more open to different ideas that they would not be open to because of non-rational reasons, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to. I don't know. I mean, trying to get this book published as well. Actually, I think one publisher rejected it, just wanting to put it in the sort of religious and spirituality category, and it's difficult. It is so difficult, and but things do change quickly. You think with consciousness used to be a totally taboo topic, and now it's taken seriously as this hard problem, and but then actually, my colleague Peter West, who's a historian of philosophy, and he had this great quote from 1937. Susan Stebbing, I think it was, saying, "Of course, all physicists believe idealism. I am yet to find a physicist who isn't an idealist."
Wow.
Remarkable, isn't it? So, I did, it's just the materialist orthodoxy sort of post-war. I don't know. I think something happened in the Second World War or something. Where,
It could be.
so humans always think they're at the end of history and and it gets into your identity. People laugh at around the time of Copernicus, people couldn't handle the evidence that the Earth wasn't in the center of the universe, and we think, oh, stupid people stuck in the religious ideology. But I just think every generation absorbs the ideology, and people laugh at them if they, don't fit in with it. And of course, there are some good reasons for some being cautious about deviations. We want to be, but yeah,
thinking flat Earth or something. Leave us comment if you're a flat earther here. Well, Dr. Goff, so we got evil on the table. And I'm looking forward to reading your new book, and maybe we could talk evil more, or skeptical theism or something like that. But I want to talk about logic, because this really amazing philosopher that I've read said that the metaphysician ought to be able to posit a entity that can make sense of consciousness. But this philosopher also said that you have to the metaphysician is obliged to also posit an entity that can make sense of logic. And so I'm wondering about agentive cosmopsychism. For the audience, that was Dr. Goff who said that. How does agentive cosmopsychism make sense of like the laws of logic, which they're not presupposed, but maybe they're presupposed, that the laws of logic seem like they need to be there already in order for the cosmopsychist agent to design the universe itself, right? Like A has to be A in order for the universe to design itself, right?
Yeah. So I think, God, this was a long time ago I wrote this paper. Someone's written a response to it that I haven't got around to reading yet. Andrew Thomas. Yeah, so I think actually when this video, I was so look, let's start with the constraint.
Yeah.
I think I think we're going for a period of history where we just focus on what's the data for theorizing about reality. We just focus on empirical data. I think there's other things. I think consciousness is another thing, but also necessary truths. We know a lot of necessary truths. So in this paper, I take the law of non-contradiction as a necessary truth. So it's not entirely unquestioned, but there will, even for logicians who reject the law of non-contradiction, there's going to be some foundational logical truths that I would say are necessary, or mathematical truths. And in my view, if something's true, there must be something in reality that makes it true, right? Truth, in some sense, is a correspondence between thought and language and reality, right? If you've got a truth without something making it true, you've just got a sentence, really. If a sentence to be true, it must mirror reality in some sense. So this constraint is, we have to say, well, just take the law of non-contradiction. What is it that makes that true? So the view I explored, it was more in a sort of kind of Hindu mysticism type conception of God, I think, of sort of universal consciousness. So the thought was, I talk about this a little bit in Galileo's Error as well. So this kind of view, philosopher I really like, Miri al-Bahari, who defends the kind of Advaita Vedanta mysticism in the tradition of analytic philosophy. So this very rigorous, logical form of argumentation. She's a great philosopher. But anyway, in some sense, the view is that consciousness, there is at the core of consciousness an element that is universal, which we can call universal consciousness. So your mind and my mind are not, on this view, are not entirely distinct, because at the core of my mind is something, namely universal consciousness, which is one and the same, literally the same thing as what is present at the core of your mind.
Right. But we have different phenomenal properties, which makes us different.
So we think of it like, there's something at the core that's the same, and then built upon that foundation, there's the contingent aspects of each conscious mind that differentiates yours from mine. So my proposal was maybe, it sounds like a possible view of the nature of consciousness that Miri thinks is experienced meditators. It's revealed to be true to them.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, but we need something that grounds the law of non-contradiction. But as you say, I mean, everything respects the law of non-contradiction. So it has to be something that it's in some sense everywhere and part of everything and there before time began and essentially fills everything.
Yeah.
So this universal consciousness business looked like one possible candidate. So maybe this universal consciousness is essentially such that it exists necessarily and it partially constitutes every possible entity, and it's essentially such that it respects the law of non-contradiction and imparts that to everything it partially constitutes. So there you've got something, a candidate for what could make true the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah. I think you said that its nature resists being I'm not using the right language, but it like resists being actuated or it resists contrary states of affairs. Like it universal consciousness isn't molded or instantiated into like contrary states of affairs. So therefore law of non-contradiction.
Yeah, that sounds a better way of putting it. Yeah. So I mean, look, I think this needs explaining. It's so obvious that people don't think it needs explaining, that like you can't get contradictory states of affairs, that it can't be raining and not raining at the same time, the same place. I mean, it's hard to get a contradiction. You can't have a square circle, but
Yeah,
you
sure.
can't. What makes that true? That's a and people used to have, like, the logical positivists used to have these kind of conventional truths, or it's a linguistic convention. I think that's very unpopular view now.
Yeah.
I think Quine basically dispensed with that. It's very unpopular view. So if these are substantive truths, what makes them true? There must be something that makes them true. So that's the thought, that maybe it's this universal consciousness that resists contradiction, sort of inherently resists contradiction. I mean, actually, I've been thinking more recently. I mean, maybe it could be just being itself has a nature that resists contradiction. I mean, actually, the view I've been thinking more recently is a kind of Aristotelian Platonism that. Sorry, I'm going off on all sorts of tangents here, but
no, this is awesome. This is like right up my audience and my alley. So this is perfect.
So the problem is something I've been thinking for a long time. That the problem with Platonism is, how the hell do you know about the things, the forms? But the problem with Aristotelianism, so Aristotle brought the forms down to earth,
right?
Brought Plato's forms down to earth. You got that famous picture of Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down. But Aristotle takes them to be contingent.
Yeah.
And so, but these are necessary truths. I mean, I think necessary truths have to be made true by something that exists necessarily. Otherwise, there'd be a possible world in which they weren't true.
Right.
So my thought is, well, maybe these can be necessary entities, but which are literally partly constitute the physical world. So they're not in Platonic heaven. So, so maybe, being itself exists necessarily, or let's put it that this sounds a bit Heideggerian or something. The form of a state of affairs, right? So
it's a little bit better than being. Yeah, it does sound Heideggerian.
The form of a state of affairs exists necessarily. So, like, if there was nothing contingent, the form of the state of affairs would still exist necessarily. But it's instantiated, and it's instantiated in the way Aristotle thought. So any state of affairs, that form is literally in the state of affairs. It's literally physically present, in the way Aristotle thought. Aristotle thought that, like, the universal of blueness is literally present here.
Right.
But then he thought, if all the blue things disappear, blueness would disappear. Why? Yeah. Why do we have to think that? Maybe blueness is really here and really everywhere where there's something blue. But when all the blue things go, blueness still exists. So that's the...
Where is that? I guess, is that... are you bringing in Plato's heaven still, like Plato's, like, the third realm or whatever? Because if you took all the blue things, put them in the blue museum, painted the museum blue, and then exploded it, there's no more blue. But obviously that's crazy. Like, that seems nuts, unless you're Armstrong or someone. But it seems nuts. So we want to say yes, there's still blue, but where is that blue? Because all the instantiations of it are destroyed. Is there a third? Is there a Platonic realm where blueness exists?
Well, because maybe what it is for blueness to be instantiated is for it to partly constitute a physical contingent state of affairs. But think about Jesus.
Okay.
Right, on the traditional Christian picture, just as an analogy.
Okay.
The Logos becomes incarnate,
Uh-huh.
right? Then the human being dies. The Logos doesn't see. Oh, I suppose you've got complications with
Yeah, right. Because
let's just say we're a non-traditional Christian where the body rots in the ground.
Okay.
But the Logos continues to exist just because it was instantiated in incarnate. It can still exist without being incarnate. So that's how I'm thinking of like blueness.
That's what we think of the soul, right? It's like a Christian dualist would say that about the soul, right?
But so for Aristotle or for David Armstrong, the blueness is a literal constituent of a. Forget Jesus. That was an unnecessary digression.
Don't forget Jesus at home, folks.
Yeah, don't forget to just
yeah,
put Jesus on hold.
Sure.
You got the blueness is a literal constituent. So you got a blue ball. The blueness is a literal constituent of the ball. But that very same thing can exist uninstantiated.
Yeah.
Why not? Why can't it exist uninstantiated?
Isn't that just Platonism though? Isn't that just that's what Plato says, I think. But they wouldn't say instantiated.
Actually, I was talking to Sophie Grace Chappell on Twitter about this, and her interpretation of Plato was kind of this. But I guess that my possibly ignorant view of Plato was I thought that the forms aren't literally physically present.
Oh yeah.
So that the object is related to blueness, but I'm thinking no, the blueness makes up the object. The forms literally partly constitute the object.
Yeah.
But it's just that
it's not just an exemplification relation. It's like they are there. Yeah. Now I see how it's.
Yeah. So now the hope is you get through the epistemological problems, because if blueness is like really here, then maybe I can be acquainted with it, or I would prefer if it's literally in my consciousness, then I can be acquainted with it and I can know its necessary properties, or and if the form of a state of affairs is literally present in any state of affairs, then I can be acquainted with it in my consciousness, and I can learn about its essential necessary properties, like the law of non-contradiction. So yeah, the hope is this Aristotelian Platonism, that might just be Plato's view, if Sophie Grace Chappell's right, is can get around the epistemological and the metaphysical, get around the epistemological issue, and also ground necessary truths, which I worry if they're contingent, I don't see.
Yeah. So this is where I like the conversation, like because I want to bring in theism, and I want to say, well, the law of non-contradiction is a proposition in God's mind about all the propositions or something, and the truth maker for it is his own character, his own nature, something like that. God cannot lie. God can, and maybe bring in some theology there. But I think that this is like the fun conversation where we say, maybe, you say, hey, I don't think so. I don't think that there is this necessary being. I think that being is necessary. And it's not an agent. And I want to say, well, there is an agent. Just put an agent at the beginning, and that's a better explanation. And now you say, well, what about evil? And that's fun. Like this is the conversation I think that I would love to see happen more often in philosophy and philosophy of religion type conversations.
Yeah, but you could incorporate this in a theistic picture where, the forms exist necessarily; they're really instantiated. Well, again, I guess then if you're going to have the view I've just described, then you'd have to have parts of God really instantiated in the physical world. Might be all right, a kind of panentheistic view.
Right,
I don't think that's too heretical, if heretical at all. But then I suppose I'm just thinking, I always want to think, what do we get from this datum? I don't think you'd get any from this datum of like explaining necessary truth or explaining moral truth for that matter. I don't see why you'd need to have theism come out of that. I don't even think I had this universal consciousness view. I don't even think actually you need the thing to be conscious anymore. I think my views developed a bit, so I think you can make sense of this Aristotelian Platonism without even thinking about any conscious. But I can see how you could combine these things with like fine tuning, maybe a bit of cosmological argument, and you could argue for some that the kind of the simplest way of account for all these things is some kind of theism. Well, at that point, though, I would say problem of Eve. If you're going to go that way, my deal breaker would be it's got to have limited powers or it's got to be, you got to tweak some of the omni properties because of evil, but that's a big discussion.
Right, and that's what I'm thinking with agentive cosmopsychism. I think it's a really important thing for theists to be thinking through. And so I think like when we're considering agentive cosmopsychism and what it seeks to accomplish, what it does accomplish, what it can explain, I think the real questions are going to be at the deeper level of like logic and consciousness instead of like the fundamental fine tuning type stuff. Because I think, or fine tuning, because I think it can make sense of fine tuning. So now we got to go deeper and say, well, can it make sense of logic? Okay, well now you have this other stuff. How does a theist make sense of logic, or how is it more parsimonious, or how is it more have more explanatory power? And that's like where the debate should be. And I just think it's fun. I just think like that's how you advance the conversation type stuff.
Absolutely. There has been a reply to this by a Christian. Who's the guy? Do you know the guy who's from Hong Kong who's really into William Lane Craig?
Yeah. Low? No, it's not Low.
My mind's gone blank.
I can't think of it now either.
Anyway,
I'm so bad with names, but Andrew Luck. Is it Andrew Luck?
Andrew, yeah, Andrew.
Yeah.
He's responded to me on, saying this isn't a good response to fine tuning, just even on that basis. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's gonna be a bigger story than that. And people have just been ignoring these middle way possibilities, I think.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of the younger folks aren't. Like a lot of people I talk with, college students, they talk about panpsychism all the time. They talk about simulation hypothesis all the time. And kind of the old way of the new atheist type stuff, it's out. It's like, no one really cares about that anymore.
Absolutely.
But a lot of the people keeping it going are Christian apologists who bring it back up and they go, "Wow, what about this?" And like, Dawkins, what are you talking about? Like,
I know.
They care about panpsychism, yeah.
And good riddance, it was so simple-minded, wasn't it? It makes me want to be a theist, really. It makes me, but then I think about,
evil.
Things annoy me equally about William Lane Craig, and so that's why, I just thought, anyway, but I agree that things, and things are, but we need to bring, into rigor and intellectual respectability. I think that people do think of a middle way between God and atheism, but they think it's all crystals and fluffy thinking, and I want to know, why should it be? Why read Miri al-Bahari and tell me that's fluffy thinking? This is why can't these topics be treated with rigor and seriousness? And so
Well, and I love that you brought that up, because a lot of it, people think New Age, they think of like California yoga, like hot yoga or something like that, and like, oh, namaste, and it's like, no, dude, there's a whole tradition here, Eastern tradition, but also like, I think you mentioned this in your essay. Aldous Huxley wrote about this and calls it the perennial philosophy, and he traces it back throughout history and says it continually pops back up, and I think he thinks it's older than theism itself too. So it's a rigorous thought that you should deal with, you should be working on, and I don't know. To me, it's just more fun. It's more fun to be thinking through this type of stuff. But I wanted to finish with I think probably some of the listeners will be thinking this too. But I've been thinking it. So even if they haven't, you talk about this in the end of Galileo's Error, which is another great book, consciousness and the meaning of life. And so if the universe designed itself, if agentive cosmopsychism is true, and we can't make sense of the logic constraint and the consciousness constraint, even the epistemological aspect of the logic constraint, what's the meaning of life if there's no overarching designer, like qua God? If there's no like the universe just designed itself, is there a meaning to life, or do we make our own meaning? What do you think about that?
Wow. So I mean, I certainly think just panpsychism is an important part of human meaning because, well, I guess I think materialism is ultimately incompatible with the reality of consciousness, and I think people feel that on an intuitive level.
Yeah.
You know, people express it by thinking love isn't just chemicals in the brain, and that sounds very trite, but I think there's something solid underlying that intuition. And
this is like the hardest problem of consciousness, or like the meta problem. It's like it's the problem of why does it seem like physicalism is false?
Yeah, how do we? Well, I suppose for someone on my side of the debate, it seems false because it is false.
Yeah, right.
Although
I'm
there
with
is
you.
still, I mean, I think, God, the meta problem is another thing. I think the meta problem arises if like Chalmers, you think you do have a totally reductionist picture of behavior, that it's all physically explicable. Then it's a bit weird. So you could give a kind of reductionist picture of me saying, "Wow, consciousness is weird," and then that starts to be a real paradox. Whereas I guess I'm not inclined to that very reductionist picture, so I'm not sure the meta problem is a big deal for me. But so I think moving to a worldview which is not incompatible with the very reality of consciousness is the first step. I am a very strong value realist.
Yeah.
Talked about this a lot, that for me there are things that are objectively pointless, like dedicating your life to counting blades of grass is objectively pointless. And
I think about you every time I mow my grass now too, because I've heard you say this a couple times. I'm like, don't count the grass, Parker, just mow it.
Yeah, I think people are bored of me talking about blades of grass. But so I mean that's a crucial point. So I mean, there's all sorts of things wrong with our worldview, that I think we have a worldview that is incompatible with the reality of consciousness, incompatible with the reality of value. And I think people just think about moral value, but value claims are ubiquitous. If there's literally no value truths, there's no reason to believe or do anything.
Yeah.
Which is horrific. But so suppose we get that. Suppose we get consciousness and we get objective value, but the universe is still going to come to nothing. I think that's not terrible. I think, again, with the dichotomy, some people say, William Lane Craig says, that is, if there's no God, everything's absolutely screwed. And he even says, there's nothing wrong with murdering people if there's no God.
Yeah.
That seems to be total overkill. And an atheist who says this is what the antinatalist guy, what's his name? Do you remember? I talk about this in my book. Anyway, the guy who thinks it's immoral to bring children into existence.
Oh yeah.
Pointless. And so I think that's overkill.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the kind of secular ideal that there's nothing problematic with the fact that the universe is going to come to nothing. I think there's something wrong there too. It would certainly, we want our lives to make a difference.
Yeah.
We want to make it. If there was a purpose to the universe and we can contribute in some ways to that greater purpose, that would be much better.
Yeah.
And I do think there are some reasons to take seriously that, like the fine tuning, the possibility that there is a point to it all, that there is a purpose that is still unfolding.
Yeah.
We don't know yet what that's all about, but that is still unfolding, and that we can in some way conceive of what we're doing as contributing to that greater purpose. I think that is a deeper way of living, that there is enough reason to take seriously, to make it worth engaging with, at least as a possibility.
Yeah. Does value realism incorporate moral realism? Is it like a subset of value realism, or are those separate things?
I would say moral realism is a subset of value realism. So, I mean, value realism is what I'm like more. So I used to be a moral anti-realist. I used to, when I first started my graduate study, I used to think, there can't be facts about good and bad, But then when I got to think, hold on, is counting blades of grass just the same as scientific advancement or pleasure?
Yeah.
Living your life for pleasure, as opposed to living your life just for the sake of counting blades of grass, something totally. Or evidence, like value claims in evidence. Like, you should believe the truth. You shouldn't believe against the evidence. You shouldn't believe
Yes.
contradictions.
I love that. Yeah.
So
Right.
it seems totally evident to me that there is objective value.
Okay.
And now, moral realism is a further claim, but I think once you believe in objective value, it's hard to me to think why you wouldn't have some sort of moral realism, because presumably, the suffering of others is bad. It's not going to be just like my suffering is bad. If suffering is bad, suffering is bad. And so, I think once you're into value realism, David Enoch is one of the leading value realists, and he kind of makes this point. He argues with value realism and says, once you're a value realist, there's probably going to be leads quite naturally to moral realism.
Okay.
I mean, maybe not like, again, coming back to my old friend William Lane Craig, he always think, the moral argument for God, it's got to be moral obligations in this kind of really hardcore sense where it's going to have to be divine commands or something. But so, there are lesser and stronger. I probably myself wouldn't believe in something like sin or, wretchedness, and I don't know, but some moral realism in the sense like other people's suffering matters.
Yeah, but so if like a serial killer who tortures people for fun is wretched, though, you'd say that, right? Like,
yeah. What do I mean when I say that? I suppose I don't believe in moral badness of the kind that God would have to punish us for. That kind of.
what about Hitler? Certainly Hitler.
No, I think what Hitler did is very bad, in the sense that the suffering he caused was terrible.
Okay.
I guess I don't believe in sort of like, oh, he's sort of scarred by sin in that sense. I mean, he did very bad things, because what he did was bad.
Yeah.
I'm repeating myself slightly. I'm kind of thinking on my feet here.
Yeah. Sorry, I know I'm dragging you down.
Yeah. The suffering, I may retract this, but the suffering he caused was bad. But I guess I don't believe in sin in some sense, like I don't believe in sin. I think people do bad things.
So, but there are objective moral facts.
Yeah, there are good and bad things, actions, states of affairs, and that it's good. That gives us reason to promote good ones and not do bad ones. But we don't become sort of guilty by doing bad ones. I don't think.
Okay. So,
that seems to me like a more old school morality. Like, and this is where I become more secular. When it gets onto ethics, I'm much more like, it seems to me like, vengeance or things. We tend not to think vengeance is or honor. These are maybe anti-realist about these kind of moral categories.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
but I mean, sin is slightly different. But yeah, those kind of moral responsibility in that sense, that you're sort of impugned and deserving of punishment. I'm not sure I go for that.
So you went in for like a particular type of truth maker theory when we were talking truths, and I wonder when it comes to like moral facts, though, aren't there moral facts that make this action or that action good or bad?
Yeah, I would say universals of
Yeah.
positive and negative value. And
Where do you ground those? Like, does panpsychism give a unique explanation? Like, are they grounded in, if you're a cosmopsychist, are they grounded in like the cosmos itself? Sorry to bring up grounding. I
so
know that's like,
my
yeah.
my la- so my la- my latest so I did have an article for Nautilus magazine where I tried to spell out like the universal consciousness view for this, but I've my thinking has changed.
Okay.
Again, it's closer to this Aristotelian Platonism. So I basically think there is, universals of positive and negative value, and which states of affairs that they are instantiated in is grounded in their nature. So the nature of goodness is essentially such that it's instantiated in pleasure, understanding. Badness is essentially such that it's instantiated in suffering, ignorance, and so on. I kind of think you need positive and negative universals, because I think the badness of suffering isn't just
A
the absence
privation.
of.
Yeah.
I don't like the privation view. So
Sure.
this is actually one reason why I'd probably depart from traditional theism. But I think badness must come from God. But that doesn't mean God's bad.
Yeah.
It just means, or the foundation of, it just means that the possibility of badness
Because you
is
think it's a
not just
positive
privation.
thing. Yeah,
It's a
it's not just a
positive thing.
negative.
So it
Yeah.
doesn't mean, God, the possibility of badness, that the form of badness is within God's being, if there is a God in some sense, or a foundational mind, a cosmopsychist mind. But that doesn't mean, the foundational mind is bad. It just means the form of badness is within.
Couldn't it be in direct contradiction? So if we I'm trying to keep in a more traditional. If God is good, there could be bad things that exist outside of him that exist by his decree, or if he allowed it to happen, whatever, however we get there could be an evil thing outside of him, and the evil is in direct opposition to his goodness. But the evil doesn't have to be posited back up into his being, does it?
Well, because what grounds the necessary truth that pain is bad? That's the thing. What grounds the necessary truth that suffering is bad? I think that is a necessary truth. So I think we need something that exists necessarily to ground it.
Wait,
And
pain is bad. Can't pain be good sometimes? Like, it
yeah,
lets us
okay,
know that we have a cut or something that
yeah,
we
it's
need to
always more
treat.
complicated. I would say ceteris paribus, pain is bad. All
Okay.
things being
Okay.
equal,
Okay.
obviously, yeah, it can be good in the round, but I just don't find it plausible that it's the privation view. So
Sure.
I think there must be the form of badness
Hmm.
at the fundamental level. Um,
Couldn't it be derivative? Like, there's the form of goodness is at the fundamental level, and the form of badness is somehow not at the fundamental level.
maybe. I'm very up-minded on these things, but I mean, my stripped down moral theory, I think, would
Yeah.
be there's just two. Here's my Platonic form. I think I want to try and do few form. Usually, when people go for Platonism, they just think, "Oh, we'll have loads of forms."
Toss them all
But
in. Yeah.
I don't know why let's be possibilities. So I would have positive. So people can tell me what this can't handle. Positive and negative universals of positive and negative value for morality. All
Okay.
morality done there.
Okay.
The form of the number for mathematics. I don't see why you have to have all of the numbers.
If you got one,
Uh,
you got them all. Yeah. It maybe zero though. Zero's a weird
um,
one.
yeah, I haven't thought this through very much.
Yeah.
But this is a general direction,
Yeah.
and for the law of non-contradiction, or for logic, the form of the state of affairs. So yeah, I just want to like a couple of forms. I mean, people, I'm. It's not exactly my skill set, like maths and logic, but I would like someone who's better at maths, philosophy of maths than me. Try and work out. You get like a minimal set of forms.
Yeah.
To get a
That's
really stripped
fascinating.
down Platonism. But yeah, in morality, I would hope that you can just make do with universals of positive and negative value.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm probably going to have to make a move in because otherwise, this is really one of the best conversations I've had in a while. And I'm going to struggle to
No,
wind
this
down.
was awesome. This was like a perfect natural place to end here. Man, Dr. Goff, thanks so much for all your time here. Thanks for stretching the limits with me and going all over the place. I really appreciate it, and really looking forward to that new book. Before I let you go, do you have any idea when that will be out or anything?
Not really. It's very early days. Just as a draft currently under review, so
Awesome.
it's
Okay.
going to be a while. No, but thanks very much. This is it's been really helped me think through some of these things, and
It's been fantastic.
yeah, not everything I've said tonight is totally thought through, but just but
I appreciate
it's
that.
good to
Yeah.
just try out ideas. People can tell me if I've made some mistakes somewhere, and yeah, I'm looking forward to actually getting back to writing some academic papers now. Actually, I've done a lot
Okay.
of popular stuff, and I need to get back to writing some academic papers. So
Yeah.
that's
Well,
good.
well, that's fantastic, and I think that I another thing to commend about you, I've said it probably already before, but I like that you have a foot in the popular world and you have a foot in the academic world, and you're kind of balancing, spinning the plate here, and I think that's what philosophers need to do more of if philosophers are going to regain the voice in the public conversation. And so I appreciate you doing that. If you guys want to check out more from Dr. Goff, look at Galileo's Error. Also check out Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, which I believe is based off your dissertation, and it's like the academic version of this one. And then I will put a link to his website in the description, and then also check out Mind Chat, where he's with Dr. Keith Frankish, and they are radically different on theories of mind, but they have awesome guests on as well, and it's just a fantastic time.
Yeah, have an argument with me on Twitter, Philip_Goff, always arguing on Twitter. And I might set up my own podcast soon, actually, for some kind of less big questions, not entirely related to consciousness.
Awesome.
But yeah, no, I totally agree. Philosophers should do more public philosophy. I'm debating with the Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of
Awesome.
Canterbury, this Friday.
Fantastic.
Having another debate with Anil Seth, who I've debated a lot, and philosopher Laura Gow. But yeah, really excited. It's so exciting doing popular philosophy, meeting Philip Pullman and Rowan Williams, and I'm gonna definitely get a selfie that I'm gonna be tweeting at the earliest opportunity. My parents are coming. I'm from Liverpool originally, so
that's so
good. I'm like a little schoolboy with this next thing.
Yeah.
Anyway,
well, folks, that's gonna have to do it for now. Dr. Goff has to go off to bed here, but this has been Parker's Pensées, and if you like it, leave us a comment, leave us a like, all that stuff, and definitely do check out the Mind Chat podcast. For now, that's it, folks. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.